Hello, I'm Frederick Regenold, a fiction writer. Several of my books are on Amazon. One of them has the title, That Note from La Jolla. Inside that book is a short novel and 7 short stories. I'd like to read one of the short stories for you now. It's called 2 Words. And the title is explained in the story, so I won't get into that. There are only 2 characters in the story, Paul and Ralph. Paul writes fiction, and Ralph is a wealthy attorney. It's audio only, with a still photo of the thumbnail cover shown during the recording. I'll read the story now. La Jolla, California, 2017. Ralph had always told Paul he could park in the driveway unless he'd be blocking Susan's car or had an oil leak, so he did. The 2-car garage door was closed. But Paul remembered that Ralph always parked his Lexus on the right, meaning he'd be presenting no problem if he parked in front of the garage door on the right also. For the last few years, Paul has been writing novels and self-publishing them on Amazon. He's had no success in getting a literary agent to represent him. Consequently, only a few friends and relatives are aware of his books. He was a bit nervous about this visit to Ralph's home because when Ralph invited him earlier on the phone, he told Paul there would be a surprise. Paul and his wife, Ruth, are friends with Ralph and his wife, Susan, but are not in the same social world. Ralph's a well-known attorney around town and has evidently done well financially. Paul secretly uses the word notorious in reference to Ralph because several of his cases are regarded by some, including Paul's wife, as shady. They rarely go any places of foursome, but sometimes encounter each other when attending parties or picnics given by mutual friends. Paul has known for several weeks that his wife is a yoga classmate of Ralph's at a studio on Grand Avenue near Rubio's. He's also learned that a male yoga practitioner is called a yogi and a female a yogini. Whenever he asks his wife how Ralph's doing in the class, she usually responds with something bordering on uncomplimentary, like, he's a know-it-all, or I think he really believes he knows more than the instructor. Paul hesitated momentarily in his car before exiting, making sure his thoughts were organized. He clearly knew that some of what was on his mind could and surely would generate an aggressive, even dangerous reaction from his host. He'd already mentally reviewed some of the possible surprises Ralph might have waiting for him, and 2 or 3 of them, one in particular, would demand some very quick thinking on his part, and quick thinking was not one of his skills. As a student of acting in college, he was always relieved to know that as long as he learned his lines well, along with the stage blocking, he'd have to do practically no emergency thinking or reacting as opposed to being a member of the debate team, where he would certainly be exposed as clumsy and sluggish with words. Writing novels, on the other hand, is a perfect fit for him in that specific department. He can write and rewrite ad nauseum. A week later, or a month, he can completely overhaul a sentence, paragraph, or chapter. In contrast, Ralph is a master word manipulator. His specialty is thinking on his feet in a courtroom. As Paul approached Ralph's front door, the last thought was uppermost in Paul's mind. He rang the doorbell. It was melodious, but had little effect on Paul's mental disorder. The door opened quickly, and there he stood, wearing a huge grin that would put any onlooker at ease, except for Paul. "How are you, buddy? Glad to see you, and glad you could come on such a short notice." They shook hands briskly, and Ralph motioned for Paul to enter and follow him. "I wrapped up some paperwork at the office, and my secretary let me escape early." He pointed to an armchair. "Sit down here and relax. I hope you're not on a tight schedule." "Not at all." Paul sat and was beginning to feel more comfortable now, and that alone permitted him to better sort out his thoughts. Since Ralph initiated the visit and deviously tacked on the surprise element, Paul decided to primarily be the listener, at least to begin with. However, knowing what a hot air whiz the attorney is, Paul knew he'd best make some key points near the beginning, or else the surprise might engulf his strategy and defeat his purpose for appearing. Regardless of what Ralph's surprise is, Paul had a few things to express. He would save the most important matter as a contingency that would depend on Ralph's surprise. That was the plan. After easing himself into the selected stuffed chair and looking directly into Ralph's squinting blue eyes, the plan suddenly made sense. To Paul, that is. The problem was, how would Paul be able to explain it to Ralph? He knew Ralph had a broad knowledge of politics, economics, history, and of course law. And he knew Ralph was extremely articulate and was a skilled public speaker. But he also categorized Ralph as somewhat of a prude who would be offended by certain words and thoughts. Paul needed to reason very carefully and promptly to choose the right words in expressing or presenting his case to Ralph. But on the other hand, he had to use words that are truthful, real, and relevant. Ralph reads a lot, but mostly nonfiction. He's fond of biographies, especially those dealing with actual historical people. But when it comes to the inner working of the human mind and the dark thoughts that sometimes lurk there, Ralph tends to avoid the subject, having trained himself to automatically sublimate his thoughts to a higher level. Or perhaps that's his way of habitually sidestepping a realm he secretly desires. As a lawyer, he has surely been exposed to many of those dark corners of the mind. To a certain extent, Paul admires that quirk in Ralph's personality, but he also feels it's a weakness on Ralph's part not to fully confront reality. Paul prides himself in being a complete realist, and in this instance knows he has to be prepared for Ralph's attempted rebuttal. Paul spoke first. He waited several seconds before doing so, making sure he had Ralph's attention. During a previous conversation a couple of weeks ago, they had gotten into a rather heated discussion about how differently they think, how their minds seem to be on different levels, especially concerning vocabulary. Ralph, in a friendly tone of voice, had been criticizing Paul's use of profanity and sexual explicitness in his novels. Paul decided to resume that train of thought now. Well, it's simple, Ralph. There's nothing really complicated about it. My thinking is different from yours, and you should try to accept that. Also, I express myself differently. I use words that you'd never use, not even in your thoughts. But I sincerely believe my words, and therefore my thoughts, are genuine. They deal with the real thing. And if you don't start dealing with reality, our country and our world, along with it, are both doomed. Ha! Ralph scoffed. I don't see what our country and our world have to do with the language you use in your novels. Your profanity and explicit sex are simply not necessary to tell a story. Profanity and sex exist, Ralph. They're part of life, whether you or I like it or not. And I find it impossible to write contemporary fiction with characters who don't speak those words or enjoy good, healthy sex. You and my wife and others I know think I should leave it out of my stories, sort of like the way it was done in movies when we were kids. The censors wouldn't permit that. So when the characters were about to enjoy sex in a scene, the screenwriter just skipped over it and went to the next scene. That's ridiculous. It's phony. And you as an attorney should be the first to see that. Some very important dialogue takes place during sex in real life. I'm not about to admit the scene because it has passionate lovemaking in it. I can't write that way. And it bugs me that you haven't read my novels just because they have profanity and sex. Paul continued. Unfortunately, it appears many literary agents think the same way. They won't even read material that contains explicit sex, convinced a mainstream publisher will never approve it. They consider it pornography, and it isn't. I don't include the detailed sex in order to physically arouse the reader. I'm simply presenting the full picture of what happens. There's nothing vulgar or filthy about it. We've all been doing it for hundreds of years, thousands of years. We wouldn't be here if we hadn't. And the sex in my stories is natural, normal. There are no handcuffs or whips, and something that seems to be emphasized in present-day popular novels. Okay, Paul, what's your point? My God, this could go on forever. I'm sure you could write a thick novel about it, and it might even sell. Paul could see that Ralph was getting impatient. Well, actually, I have several points. Or let's say that my main point has more than one facet. Basically, I'm saying that's what's wrong with the world. Ralph got a weird look on his face and stared intensely at Paul. What the hell are you talking about? Are you implying that the problem with the world is how diversely people interpret sex? Well, I'm not sure I'd use the word interpret, Paul answered. But I would say that a proportionately large number of people in the world have not had good sex. They really don't know what good sex is. A little research will show you that a shocking percentage of females have never had an orgasm with a man. Yeah, maybe with a dildo or their hand or another woman. And the reason is that many men don't know the first thing about making love, giving pleasure to their partner. And that's what making love is all about. Most guys climb on a female, penetrate her, then in 5 minutes, sometimes less, they have an orgasm, satisfying themselves. And their disappointed female partner is just beginning to edge her way into the orgasmic zone. But it's over for her. I saw an episode in a TV series the other night in which a man and woman who apparently had strong feelings for each other finally found themselves alone with the good possibility no one would interrupt them. Quietly and quickly, they both did what was necessary with the clothes they wore. And he started humping her against the wall. It was all over within 15 seconds, maybe 20. That was the writer's or the director's idea of intimacy. And I wouldn't be surprised if many viewers agreed. Well, the sex in my stories is the giving type, not the taking type. My simple contention is that a human being who has experienced true love and the physical passion that accompanies it is far less likely to have any interest whatsoever in causing societal problems, controlling masses of other people, taking over the world or another country. It's almost a sure bet that Hitler, Mussolini, Hirohito, Stalin, the current nutso in North Korea, and the present leader in Iran have never had a beautiful, loving, sexual relationship. Oh, sure, Paul, with sarcasm. I'd live to watch you with an interpreter explaining that to Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Ralph's facial expression was more relaxed now. He knew the next topic would suck Paul in even more and grab his attention. I think you told me that every query letter you sent to an agent has been rejected. Can that be true? Nothing but rejections, Paul answered. Yet my novels haven't been rejected, just my query letters. No agent has read any of my novels, motioning his hand in desperation. Paul continued. So obviously, my query letters are substandard. But I've tried a variety of approaches, and the result is always the same. Paul could see that Ralph was softening a bit, and at least was listening. I have 4 completely different stories. One of those 4 is a complete adult version of an abbreviated, sanitized account of a sweet love story that has no sex or profanity. I wrote the latter novel first, attempting to produce something my wife might approve of. I read through it now, I read through it now, and I fully realize it's devoid of reality. The actual word that's out there, that exists, doesn't work that way. So, I added 10 chapters and took a deeper, closer look at the two main characters. The second version represents reality. With my background as a student of acting, I know that all 4 of those stories with the adult content will sell. I know how to write dialogue that sounds real. And if these stories become movies, there's definitely one Best Actor Oscar in each of the 4 stories, maybe more in 2 of them. Ralph chuckled. You really believe that, don't you? He was paying attention now. I'm curious. Which characters in which novels? Now Paul was stunned. If I told you, you wouldn't know what I'm talking about. You have to know the stories and the characters, and you don't. Ralph nervously changed his sitting position on the sofa because he knew he was sliding into an area of their conversation where he'd eventually have to disclose that he knew more than what Paul thought. They were in Ralph's living room, which provided a spectacular view of the Pacific Ocean. Ralph's a prominent attorney and is financially well off. Paul was reasonably at ease now in that stuffed armchair across from Ralph. Ralph decided to let some of his strategy trickle into their talk. I know a little about the stories from reading what's on Amazon, and Ruth and I go to that new ice cream shop, Luigi's, that's diagonally across from Rubio's, after we finish our yoga class. She knows some of the stories too, and we talk about them while having ice cream. The male character in Cat Plays Piano is a retired priest, right? I can't believe this. Paul kept his voice down, but his emotions were shouting. Ruth has actually read some of my work? Then answering Ralph's question. Yes, the main male character tells the main female and her father he's a retired Catholic priest. Look, Paul, don't get upset. Ruth was afraid you'd be let down if you knew she read your novels. All of your friends and hers know you regard her as sort of a saint who's very religious and wouldn't think of reading the type of stories you write. But she was interested. She's human. Now butting in on Ralph. I wonder how much she's read. Paul was sincerely confused. This is incredible. Also the fact that she's kept it from me. Paul was beginning to wonder what else his wife kept from him. That female character in Kate Plays Piano is black, correct? Ralph tried to divert Paul's train of thought. Yeah, she's African-American who received a large financial settlement in the divorce proceedings from her husband and lives in an elegant home on the cliff above the La Jolla Caves. Paul was having trouble concentrating on the conversation now. He was staggered to know his wife, Ruth, knew anything about his stories, except that they contained profanity and sex, something he knew she didn't approve of in his writing. Ralph continued with his distraction. You think one of the actors who'd be in that movie would win an Oscar? Both actors who portray the two main characters would. Those roles have Oscar written all over them. The material's there, the situation's there, the dialogue's there. Any talented actor would feast on either role. What about Seppuku? That has a Japanese girl in it. You know the titles, exclaimed Paul. Yes, that's Mikiko Ohara. She comes to this country to get revenge for her grandmother, who committed suicide when the American serviceman who impregnated her grandmother disappeared. Do you know what a seppuku is? Nodding, Ralph didn't pause. That's Japanese ritualistic suicide, using a dagger in your stomach. I read that on Amazon. Then adding without missing a beat, you think the actress who plays Mikiko in the movie would win an Oscar? Absolutely, if she has the talent to interpret what I've written. Would be the first Japanese female to win the Best Actress award. The male character has good material too, but I doubt it has the emotional range for an Oscar. However, look at the role that took an Oscar this year. The actor hardly changed expressions. I'm not disparaging his portrayal. He delivered what was written for him and more than likely followed the director's instructions. But I don't think that role was Oscar caliber, especially when you compare it with what the other nominees did. Paul got up and stood directly in front of Ralph. So both of you have been discussing my work and not telling me. Ralph knew at this point he was getting closer and closer to the reason he'd invited Paul to his home. It was similar to the feeling he's had many times in the courtroom when he was about to present his final argument or summation for a case. Paul, on the other hand, who thought he had a clear conception of his plan when he entered Ralph's home, was beginning to feel the rug slipping from under his footing. Let's face it, Paul, since you started writing your stories about 5 or 6 years ago, you've been living in a fictional cocoon. The real world, including Ruth, hasn't existed for you. All the characters and situations in your stories have been the only reality in your mind. Paul listened attentively, slowly beginning to realize he was perhaps guilty of the very fault he'd been using to describe Ralph. Ralph could tell now it was time to unload the first salvo of his planned attack on Paul. Paul, Ruth and I have read all of your novels, and we liked them. Then, in an attempt to distract him from the initial sting, where in the hell did you come up with that pen name? Ralph knew the answer, but acted like he didn't. Ruth had told him. Paul was mentally and emotionally reeling now and tried to make sense of Ralph's words. Ruth has bought antiques from a dealer in Baden-Baden, Germany, with that name. My name, Paul Smith, is disgustingly common, at least for an author. There must be millions of us just in the U.S. I liked the look of this German last name, especially on the front cover of the novel. I had an uncle with that first name who lived in New Orleans. I just put the two names together so my pit name would look and sound more literary than Paul Smith. I Googled it to see if there were others with that same name and couldn't find any. A man who was born in a small town in Arkansas had that same name, but he died in the last century. So I used it. You don't like it? It's fine. Ruth and I both like it. I wondered how you picked it. Ralph easily could see that Paul was on the ropes now and decided not to let him off. The storyline for Nazrin's escape is about a young Iranian girl whose parents sent her to this country before the revolution in hers. Where did that story come from? Well, I like the work of a particular actress, Gina Gershon. I think she's terribly underrated. They've typecast her as nothing more than a sex pot, but I've seen her in dramatically nuanced roles where she performed flawlessly. I just invented the story for her based on what I knew about things that happened in Iran. The personal material about the character, I just invented it. She's a terrific actress and deserves something she can really get her teeth into. Damn, that's quite a story. You have a hell of an imagination. You think she'd win the Oscar? Ralph smiled. If Gina portrays that character, I'd bet on it. Of course, she may be too old now. However, she still looks hot in recent photos. I wrote the character, that Iranian female, to take advantage of her sensuality. Gina Gershon is sex personified and a very talented actress. Ralph knew he was on a roll now and wanted to keep the momentum up in order to make his final strike. He was glad to see Paul sit again. My favorite, and I think you told Ruth it's yours too, is A Limo World. Wow, 2 volumes. It's beyond me how you can invent all those different characters and put them into a story that held my attention from start to finish. Who do you think would win the Academy Award if this were made into a movie? The girl who plays Nora will be the first Chinese American to win a Best Actress Oscar. Of course, the actress could be a Chinese citizen, as long as she speaks English fluently, like someone who grew up here and looks the part. It's a great role. I wrote it that way. It has everything any actor or director has ever dreamed of. And if my sale of the movie rights can possibly legally include such a clause, I'll make damn sure that no Caucasian actress will portray either Nora or Mikiko in Asian makeup. Also, there are numerous other characters whose portrayals in the movie version of this story would bring supporting actor nominations. Paul appeared more relaxed now. He sat back in a comfortable position in the chair. As for putting the story together and getting it onto my computer, it may seem strange to you, but I actually asked God to help me. Ha! Ralph couldn't resist. With all that profanity and detailed sex? Well, there's a lot more to my story than that, Ralph. There is spirituality and love. All of my novels are love stories. This one has a vein of religion running through it. Nat's mother is Jewish, and Nora is a devout Catholic. Nora introduces Nat to Catholicism. I promise God that although there is a lot of profanity and sex, the overall story would be worthwhile and present human situations we all confront. There were many passages while I was writing the story that were dictated to me by some voice in my mind. I think it was God's voice. The words came so quickly that sometimes I had to ask the voice to slow down. I was unable to type that fast. And later, when I read those passages, I couldn't believe I had written them. I love what's there, and I'm grateful for the help I received from God. Ralph, knowing he was nearing the place in their conversation where he would virtually let the air out of Paul and watch him shrivel up like a helpless worm, nodded sympathetically and allowed him to continue dreaming aloud in his cocoon. "We're talking about movies and actors," resumed Paul, "but that's pretty much out of my control. I have to get my novels published first. One thing I'd like to touch on, and you'll think it's brash, and maybe it is, but I want you to remember me telling you this. A limo world will break all the sales records set by the 50 Shades trilogy." Paul started laughing a little. "You wait and see. My story is much more interesting and realistic." He emphasized the last word. "The characters, a whole bunch, are more colorful and likable. You know, you've read it. There's an ex-CIA operative who lives at the hotel with a fake name. His family was murdered at the beginning of the story on the Seychelles Islands. There's a Chinese-American office manager, that's Nora, whose parents are from Taiwan. A nurse who falls in love with the CIA operative is from Argentina and speaks Spanish. A sexy female resident who takes the main male character, the limo driver, to Tahiti and Honolulu is a French-speaking Tahitian. During the trip to Tahiti, there are 2 Tahitian sisters who are out of this world. There's a black LVN with a patient at the hotel who's in love with Nat. There's a gynecologist who went to medical school at Duke University. An ex-porn star meets Nat at church and falls in love with him. Her given name is Florence, like the hurricane. That's a great part. And these are just the females. There are many more. And they are 3-dimensional people who live and breathe and talk like human beings. The sex in my story is the real thing. Sure, I describe it in detail, but there's nothing phony about it, and it's intrinsic to the story." He pauses here to underscore his next statement. "A Limo World will be the most popular novel worldwide in the 21st century. Others may come later, but up to now, it will be the most popular. It'll be translated into many languages." Paul smiled with confidence. Ralph let him revel. "There's some reviews on Amazon. I read them." "Yeah, there's been a handful from friends and relatives and one complete stranger. But you have to realize virtually nobody looks for a book on Amazon unless they've heard of it or read about it. You can have a masterpiece available on Amazon, and unless a potential reader has heard of it, it won't be sold. If a story that equals the quality of Catcher in the Rye or To Kill a Mockingbird were put there by an unknown writer like myself, there's a good possibility no one would ever buy either, because they wouldn't know about them unless the author has a social media following. That's another hurdle for beginning writers. And the authors of the 2 books I mentioned, if beginning now and unknown, would probably have no social media following, like me. Both J.D. Salinger and Harper Lee were very private people. It's beyond my comprehension that either of them would be chatting on the internet. No way. I think Harper Lee said that her novel spoke for itself. Paul was answering Ralph's questions, but even while he was talking, His mind was focusing on the yoga class, Luigi's ice cream shop, and the fact that Ruth and Ralph had read his novels and concealed it from him. Ralph, however, had brought up a subject that was dear to Paul, so Paul continued. There are no doubt dozens of beautifully written, extremely interesting stories out there we'll never see or hear of because a literary agent never read them in order to represent that author. I understand the reason, and I'm not really blaming the agents. Hell, they get tons of crap coming into their offices by email. Absolute junk. There are millions of people out there who think they can write a novel, but they can't. The agents probably train an assistant or a secretary to screen what comes in. Agents have a fairly concrete idea of what they're looking for, and they or their assistants glance through the flood of query emails, hoping they can spot the novel they want to push for publication. Most people don't understand that a query letter to an agent has to be in a certain form. The first paragraph must contain this, and the second paragraph that. It all has to be on one page. Many writers who can write decent stories simply cannot write a decent query letter. I'm one of them. So getting back to Amazon, if any reader went there on the internet and typed in the title of one of my novels, they'd see a photo of the cover and be able to read a little bit about the story and me, the author. And they might actually purchase the paperback or the digital version. The problem is they've never heard of my titles, and they'll never go to Amazon to look for them. If they Google the author's name that's shown on the covers, that would lead them to a website that has a lot of information about the novels and the author. But they're not going to Google a name they've never heard of. It's a losing battle. And the author can't possibly win unless he or she has a literary agent who believes in the story enough to find a publisher. So, we're back to the query letter. Considering himself a realist, Paul now had to get to the point. He concentrated on Ralph's eyes. He really didn't want to ask the question, but he had to. Is there something going on with you and Ruth that I should know about? Something you're keeping from me? The time had come and Ralph knew it. He stood because, as in a courtroom, he could think better on his feet. He looked down on Paul, and that gave him a better sense of strength, seeing Paul in a sitting position. Ralph's plan had come to the climax. He went forward, knowing there was no return. He released the words. Ruth and I have had a relationship for the last 5 years. We love each other. She wants out of her marriage with you, and Susan and I haven't been compatible for a long spell. It's over. We'll just go through the motions for appearance sake. It's a shut case, and we both want to close it. It's reality, Paul, and you have no choice but to accept it. It wasn't the courtroom, but Ralph was satisfied with his rather direct and short presentation. He knew he had Paul cornered, and there was no escape for him. A slight smile came over Paul's face as he kept his eyes on Ralph's. Paul remained sitting, bent forward, and then started laughing uncontrollably. Ralph had never seen Paul laugh like this. Raising his voice so Paul could hear him over his laughter, Ralph was almost screaming. You think it's as funny, huh? Something you can write about in a novel, I guess. You can use your imagination and everything will come out smelling like roses. Paul waved him off and tried to get control of himself. No. Sit down and shut up, will you? We've known each other for several years. We can talk like two intelligent human beings. You're not the president of a country, and neither am I. We're not going to start a war and start killing each other. I realize something now I never knew before. You're a realist, too. I didn't think you were. A few minutes ago, I came through your front door with huge misgivings. I knew what I had to tell you, and I had a plan. But I wasn't sure I could pull it off without an explosion. I'm sure Ruth has told you I hate arguments. Ralph said about halfway through Paul's last words, then abruptly stood again. What the hell are you talking about? Easy, man, easy. Just pause and relax. Paul stopped laughing, but stayed in the chair. He had a pleasant look on his face. I told you at the beginning, it's simple. Nothing complicated about it. I don't need my plan now. You solved the problem for me. Just listen and try not to get upset. Susan, your wife, and I have been together for about 3 years. We love each other. She's the greatest sex I've ever had in my life. We can't seem to get enough of each other. If Ruth wants to divorce me, fine. I understand, no problem. I don't think Susan and I will get married. We just love to give each other pleasure sexually. That's what it's all about, right? He focused on Ralph to make sure he was listening. Evidently he was, with his mouth open. You still got that delicious scotch you keep hidden away, buddy? Let's toast to it. Ralph, in somewhat of a daze, with a blank look on his face, went to a cabinet and got a bottle and 2 glasses. He carefully put the glasses on the table and in front of the sofa and opened the bottle. Paul sat on the sofa next to Ralph. Ralph poured, put the bottle down, and they both raised their glasses and clinked them together. Paul looked fondly at Ralph and spoke. To our future with different women. May it be happy and realistic. They both completed the toast by drinking from the glasses. Then Ralph chuckled. You chose the correct word, Paul, licking his top lip, then smiling at Ralph. I don't follow you. Oh, I'm not surprised you don't. Ralph leaned back on the sofa and proceeded to elucidate. There's a significant difference between the words realistic and real. And although you think of yourself as a writer or a storyteller, you may not actually know the difference. Ralph turned his body now so he could face Paul directly. Realistic fits you, Paul. Yes, your writing is realistic. But the word real fits me. I'm real, buddy. I have to get up every morning and face reality. I have to produce. I have to win cases in a courtroom, sometimes in a hostile environment, or otherwise I'm dead in the water. You can crawl into your cocoon and sit for hours in front of your keyboard and monitor and think up BS. And that's what it is, Paul. BS and nothing more. You live in an imaginary world in which you dream up all kinds of characters who are also nothing but BS. But that's all fiction writers like you are, BS artists. You turn out this phony crap that you sell. Well, you don't because you can't attract an agent. But it's sold to all the idiots all over the world who read this made-up junk. It's sickening, man. I don't see how you can look in the mirror when you shave. Yeah, realistic is the right word for you. It means the semblance of reality. But it is not reality. Then Ralph leaned close to Paul. You're looking at reality, buddy. A slow smile came over Ralph's face. I'm not really sure what you are. Now Paul's mouth was open, and he wasn't licking his top lip. He got up from the sofa slowly, without looking at Ralph, and spoke the words very carefully. You can take your bottle of scotch and stick it you know where. Paul then walked toward the front door, realizing every step of the way that although there had been the surprise Ralph promised, his plan, the plan he had when he entered Ralph's home, did indeed work. As for Ruth, he'd deal with that later. Paul's next plan is to phone Susan on her cell and share the reality with her. That's the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it and will read my other stories and novels that are on Amazon.